Well, hello, and welcome to the next of our series of studies looking at Luke's Gospel. Today we're in Luke chapter 7, and we're looking at verses 11 to 17. So if you do have a Bible, can I encourage you to open it, and I'm going to read the passage. So Luke 7, starting at verse 11. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier where they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared amongst us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So here is another remarkable episode recorded in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus stopping a funeral. And the funeral is for, it says, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. So here's a lady who's a widow. She's lost her husband, and now she's lost her only son. And remember, back in those days, it was a culture in which obviously the male within the family would have been the breadwinner and would have been the salary earner. And so the death of the last male in the family would have meant poverty for a family, poverty for this widow, and also the loss of the family name as well, which was carried through the male heir. So this could be the end of the family itself. And obviously this widow, as you'd expect, was filled with grief as the body of her son is being carried out in the funeral procession. But here's Jesus's compassion. We're told in verse 13, when Jesus, the Lord, saw her, his heart went out to her. Now, his heart went out to her is not a particularly great translation here. There's a similar word used to when Jesus has compassion on the people with the feeding of the 5,000. He has compassion on the crowd and he feeds them. Or here his compassion comes from the guts, if you like, from the bowels is where traditionally the sort of Jewish nation, we tend to say, well, people from the heart, but in Jewish culture it was from the bowels. So Jesus has compassion from his bowels upon her, if you like. So his heart goes out to her. He has compassion on her and he says, "Don't cry." Now, saying "don't cry" at a funeral can be a very unhelpful thing to say, because naturally as human beings we want to grieve for those whom we lost. So we think, is Jesus being insensitive here? But no, Jesus is going to do a miracle of not resurrection, but if you like, resuscitation at this point. And so we have to recognize that back in those days, if you touched a dead body or surrounding whatever surrounding they were carrying the body on, it says on it with some bearers, that the person who touches anything to do with death is ceremonially unclean for 7 days and has to go into a quarantine and see the priest at the end and all those kind of things. Well, remember that Jesus does not become unclean. He actually cleans the unclean. So by touching here the dead young man, or touching what he was being carried upon, it's Jesus that brings healing and new life. So rather than him being made unclean, he touches something that's unclean, dead body, and brings it back to life, makes it, if you like, clean again. And he does that simply through his word. He said to the young man, "I say to you, get up." Again, we can lose some of the interesting force of the original here, because the word for get up is the word for resurrection, if you like. Get up, stand up, anastasis. And the man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. So Jesus, if you like, brings this man back to life simply through his word. You can see again, Luke is emphasizing to us, as he has in other episodes, the power and authority of the words of Jesus. These are words that can bring new life where there is death. And so Jesus' words even reach the dead. And so if Jesus has power or authority over death, then surely nothing is beyond his power and authority. We are powerless over death. Some of you may remember the famous boxer, Muhammad Ali. He fought 56 different fighters, including some of the best in the world: Sonny Liston, Henry Cooper, Joe Bugner, Joe Frazier, George Foreman. He beat all of these boxers, but couldn't beat death itself. He was called the greatest, but even the greatest had no power over death. We have a 10 out of 10 chance of dying. But the good news here is that Jesus has power and authority over death, and he does it simply through his words. So Jesus has power over something that we have no power over. Now, we shouldn't minimize death. There's a famous poem that's sometimes read at funerals or at the graveside by Henry Scott Holland, who I believe was working at St Paul's Cathedral at the time. And it goes something like, "Death is nothing at all. It doesn't count. I've simply moved on, or I'm in the other room. I've slipped away." Well, that's not true. We know that death hurts. The death of a loved one really hurts. And often our question to God is, well, why doesn't God do something about it? Does God really care? Now, Jesus didn't go around cemeteries at the time or around the tombs where people were buried, bringing people back from the dead, resuscitating and resurrecting people. He only did it with a select number of people. God so loved this widow, if you like, he gave her back his only son. God so loved this widow, he gave her back his only son. A picture of what he was to do. That God so loved the world, that he gave his only son to bring us out of the eternity of death to an eternity of life. You see, Jesus's death is what really ends death. This young man would have been resuscitated, brought back to life, if you like, but he wasn't resurrected for eternity at this point. He would still have gone on to die later in his life. We don't know when. Luke doesn't tell us that information that we may like to know. But Jesus' death ends death permanently. His death gives us life for eternity. We're told that if Jesus, when the dead hear Jesus' voice, they will rise from the dead. And so the purpose of this passage is twofold. First of all, it shows the compassion of Jesus on this particular person who is hurting. But also it's a preview of the future. It's a preview of a future where there will be no death or dying or mourning or pain or crying or tissues or undertakers. It's when we have a new heavens and a new earth. You can read about it at the end of the book of Revelation, chapters 20, 21. Well, we have to recognize here that this is a preview of the future. And so at this point, we need to trust Jesus with our future. We need to trust Jesus with our life and our death, recognizing the power and authority is in his hands, and his words are more powerful than death. So do we trust his promises enough to entrust our life and our death into his hands?